Good morning and welcome to the second part of the St. Gallen Symposium. I hope you had a great evening yesterday. Maybe some of you have seen the IC Lounge and some of you even afterwards at the open house night. So I hope you're not too tired because you have quite a program today. And yeah, today you're going to start here at the Aula with a session regarding China and Europe, the relationship. And directly afterwards, the main part of the time before the lunch break, we'll go to discuss about the core mission of the St. Gallen Symposium. And we would like to discuss how can we achieve intergenerational fairness and develop a new generational contract.
So intergenerational fairness, how do we negotiate that? And most importantly, what formats do we negotiate that in? So I would encourage all of you in this room and those watching at home to use the interactive tools we've developed. And this year we have quite a few. We have the Transformation Lab. We have the collaboration with Zeit Online, where you are matched with someone who has a vastly differing opinion than you do, and you'll engage in a critical discussion. And we have the Zukunftsfabrik 2050. And that is all on the campus site. So please, these formats live from their interactivity. Engage. The kind of conversations we get out of those formats are what makes the richness of St. Gallen.
Yeah, and in the afternoon, we're going to have the session regarding the new role of NATO. And we're really happy to have here Karolina Grabar-Kitarovic, the fourth president of the Republic of Croatia, Benedikt Franke, the vice chairman and CEO of the Munich Security Conference, and Lisa Jasko, member of the Ukrainian parliament. In parallel, we have some more sessions, one session regarding energy insecurity and food insecurity. And afterwards, unfortunately, we're almost over. Then we'll have our closing ceremony, where you'll be able to see the whole team. And then 51st St. Gallen Symposium comes to an end.
Which seems odd since we're only just getting started. I want to just point out one more thing. This afternoon, you'll be able to meet the leaders of tomorrow. You got an insight into their thoughts about their ambitions, their visions, their thoughts about the immediate future in our essay competition last night. But that was only 3 of them. So I'd encourage you to come back to the Aula midday today to learn more about the Leaders of Tomorrow report and about who they are as individuals. So thank you, and with that, over to China. I said yesterday in my closing comments that this morning was going to address the proverbial elephant in the room, because right after the war on Ukraine, we are beginning to think about new global order around what this unprovoked war of aggression across sovereign territory right at the heart of Europe means for the future of world order. And right on the other side, of course, is the quintessential power that for the first time in America's history can rival the United States economically and with a system politically that's becoming more and more attractive because it's taken away the old logic that the CCP used to parlay in the Cold War and returned a vision around efficiency, around productivity, and we have all, not unlike Russia, tethered our productive capacities to China. So this morning we'll discuss with 2 colleagues, hopefully, if the video link lasts, in China, and 2 formidable colleagues here in the room. So let me bring up my panel now and introduce them to you, please. We sometimes struggle with the technology. So let me tell you how we're going to steward this conversation. We're first going to talk to our colleagues, hopefully in China. We're waiting for one more video link to come to us. And then we will reflect what has been said all the way across the globe with our panel in the room. So let me introduce first these formidable individuals sitting right to the left of me. We have Katalin Sey, who some of you may know if you're following the European Parliament closely. She is the member of the European Parliament from the Momentum Party, Hungary's opposition. And you'll know maybe that in this past election, we had a very interesting coalition building going on between all opposition parties to offer a counterweight to Viktor Orban's Fidesz. And we'll talk about the split between autocracy and democracy, whether that's fair, whether that's right, whether that actually gives us something on the values bench to discuss with China or not in just a moment. She's also a member for the delegation for the United States, and all of you will know that in June, the American Conservative Action Committee is meeting in Hungary, and the president of Hungary, or the prime minister of Hungary, will be a guest speaker. So we will talk about that perhaps as well. All the way to my left is Markus Gabriel, and for those of you who are interested in philosophy and the future of thought, you will have read his books. He's a prolific author. He is at the New Institute, where he leads the Foundation of Value and Values. So you see there's an echo on that main theme here at the stage. He also holds the chair in epistemology, modern and contemporary philosophy at the University of Bonn. Welcome to the stage, Marcus. And joining us from China, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Feng Zhongping. He's the director and professor of the Institute of European Studies, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the president of the CCE Institute, the president of the Chinese Association for European Studies. He is the most, apparently, busy man in all of China. We're thrilled to have you. You're an expert on China-NATO relations. And in that sense, Professor Feng, I want to start with you. This war at the heart of Europe, the war in Ukraine, what has that taught China, the Chinese leadership, about Europe?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to join this symposium. Great question. Okay, this war is not just in Europe. This is a war affects everybody in the world, affecting China, affecting many other parts of the world. When we talk about Europe and China, I'm thinking about, what are the priorities for Europeans and Chinese? We can have a long list of this from both China and European countries. But I guess, peace, prosperity are the most important ones. Let's have I think the whole European mission of European states and end of the Second World War was to build, to construct the peace in the place which having suffered two hot wars, global world of hot wars, and one cold war. This all Europe was the battlefield, major battlefield of this two world wars, one cold war last century. And so peace is the most important thing. You are right. Okay. I think China and Europe should work closely to try to find out ways, solutions to make the war to end, as quick as possible. That is the one thing. Prosperity is another. I think economic growth is it's in the Chinese interest, it's in the European country's interest. And what we can do, Europe have suffered in the last 10 years, more than 10 years, global international financial crisis, sovereignty debt crisis, refugees crisis, pandemic, and then the Ukraine crisis. Ukraine crisis is also economic problem crisis for European countries. We saw the oil price. We see the food crisis. And China is European Union, 27 countries' largest trading partner. So naturally, I just focus on two things. I think one is let's try to work together to bring this war to end, to early end, quick end. Second is we have to think about the post-pandemic economic growth. Thank you.
I'm going to follow up right there with a question in terms of what China's role might be in bringing this war to an end. We saw an enormous amount of what we in diplomacy call triangulation, which is to say European partners, the United States, trying to engage other countries that in the UN Security Council abstained from the vote on Ukraine in an effort, of course, from the perspective of the enlarged West, and I think particularly also of Japan, I think of Australia, to create influence. And I, of course, am looking forward to your views on that. But before you answer that question, I just want to underscore that you have made the point that, of course, China seeks stability in the world, its economic development, its prosperity, the incredible ambitious plans that Xi Jinping has put on the table, whether it's Made in China 2050, its AI strategy, can only be realized if there is stability in the world. And so then back to that original question, you know that the Europeans are willing to suffer over their values. They've decided a sanctions package. They've now decided a structured phase out of Russian oil. They're willing to take some pain to support and defend their values and their institutions. How does China react now that Russia has needs? It's been cut off from the international economic system, effectively. It is being cut off in terms of the role that energy might be able to play to finance this war. Does China come in and help Russia, as it's sort of outlined in the Friendship Treaty from February 7th, which builds on successive friendship treaties? Will China buy Russian oil? Will it help Russia in its technological needs? How will China position itself on these very concrete issues?
Okay, I think China has already expressed its views. I mean, the government, the war is not in China's interest. It's not in Switzerland's interest. It's not in European countries' interest. But how to end the war? Okay, I think China can make some influence through its own ways, diplomatic ways. China is close allies. We have good relations with Russia. Russia is our close neighbor. And the European Union, European countries, including Switzerland, is our very important, I should say, most important trading economic partners. And Ukraine is also China's friend. So in this such a complex situation, China needs to be cautious to maintain the good relations with both Russia, European countries, Ukraine. China can do everything it can to help in terms of humanitarian suffering in Ukraine. China can also make contributions in helping the refugees in Poland, for example, which has already done. China's influence can be closed-door diplomatic, silent, closed-door diplomatic approach. I think all these things China can do because, all the development we have reached in the past 3-4 decades has been the result of the close links, connections between China and the outside world, especially European countries, developed world. So China is clearly seeing the dangers of this being cut off. That's why we try to make a very difficult, decisions, balance, if you like, to maintain relations, normal relations with both Moscow, European countries, and Ukraine. China is doing all it can do to do this.
But then there's the other big partner across the Pacific in your case, in the United States. And while it's very interesting, and I hope you can share with us who China might be conversing with on the issues of economic issues, energy issues, and I will ask you those questions again. But if you have the American Secretary of Defense say that the American intention is to weaken Russia systemically as part of the course of this war, and then we see yesterday a tweet from the Chinese government that says South Korea should watch out if it went the Ukrainian way, interpretation left open. what is and the Chinese are masters of strategy, and we're not going to deny that. What is that? What is the Chinese game here?
In our region, neighborhood.
Well, it's to understand if you can, you might read the pronunciations by Lloyd Austin as a specific systemic provocation. And depending on how that is read in Beijing, that might, I'm asking you, lead to the kind of point made against South Korea or not. The question is, how does China then think about its own regional security and issues of sovereignty in its region when the United States is beginning to shift its line on the war in Ukraine?
Okay, there is a hot debate in China about, America global strategic center, the focus of U.S. strategic, global strategic point. I think, some people are talking about America is back to Europe, which means, U.S. strategic focus again shift to the Russia, to the Ukraine. Some people, do not agree with this point. Personally, I don't think, United States has given up its Pacific-focused strategic approach. I think United States continually think, consider China is a comprehensive strategic competitor. So we have to fully understand this. That is why, Chinese foreign policy has to be considerate all these things, at once. We are very much concerned about what the United States is doing in our neighborhood. Although we are, always watching closely what is going on in Ukraine, what's the problem between Russia and the United States, Ukraine, with the United States, Russia, European sanctions against Russia. But imagine if you were the leader of China, your focus is always here in this part of the world. We are very much worried about, strategic rival, between these two powers, between China and the United States, and particularly, what Biden administration is doing in terms of its policies with Taiwan, part of China. It has nothing to do with compared with Ukraine, but America is doing a lot of dangerous things. It seems to me, in terms of encourage the independence of Taiwan, and also the whole picture of this Indo-Pacific strategy. Including, all-party security dialogue, which brings South Korea, India, Australia, United States, and also this AUKUS, which was just established a couple of months ago, end of last year. It's about the UK, Australian, and the United States. We have to be very careful about America's policies, strategy in this part of China, world. Thank you.
Well, clearly there is some more in-depth American strategic thought going in, and you've named the elements AUKUS, the Quad, of course, this great concern about the security alliance between China and the Solomon Islands. Speaking from the American perspective, only very recently, clearly we have many issues to address there, hopefully in diplomatic collaboration. And I'm particularly pleased that my former boss, Nicholas Burns, is now the U.S. ambassador to China. You have in him a very good American diplomat to raise even these very difficult and controversial issues. But before we take this to the room, and we will talk about Taiwan because we are in Europe, and that's a critical, important issue around sovereignty and issues that we need to highlight there. I do want to come back one more time and ask you those quick-fire questions. Will China buy Russia's oil? will China continue to support and expand technological help, semiconductors, and beyond to the Russian Federation?
Okay. Most European countries is still buying Russian oil now. I understand, they will stop doing this, hopefully, they hope by the end of this year. And the gas, I imagine, will continue to buy. And coal stopped by the August. This is our plan. There's a clear timetable. But there is uncertainty, up to the whole long this war is going to end, and the whole European countries as a whole to think about their life, they need to think about the whole coexistence with Russia. Russia will not care. After finally the war is over. Russia will be there. People will think about, it is your neighborhood. It's a close neighbor. And I don't think, I can imagine, Europeans are trying to think about why should we buy Russian oil. At the same time, Russia is launching a war, using this money, which is paid by the Europeans for buying the oil to fighting in Ukraine. I can understand perfectly logic, but I think, this is just for a moment. We need to think about, post when the war is over, eventually. So India is continuing buying Russia's oil. And the whole world, there are many countries which condemn Russia's behavior, Russia's action, operation, but only about 35 countries which imposed sanctions, but not all sanctions are including energy, oil. I mean, we need to think about Europeans' approach. We need to think about the Western approach, but we have to also think about, in this very important symposium, think about, non-European countries' logic.
Yeah.
Their rationale.
Yeah, I think.
Think about non-Western countries' logic, rationale. We are living in a world, we are not just, having one, how to say this? I mean, we have different
perspectives. Geography matters. Geography matters.
Yes.
We have
Exactly.
brought this theme up a number of times here in our conversations, and so I want to turn to Katalin to get an impression of how this is being thought about strategically, potentially in Brussels. Not that we Europeans are known for a lot of strategic foresight, let's say, but of course there is this linkage. We are going to, exaggerating a little bit because this is an American vision of what might happen with Russia. Certainly if the nuclear option is on the table, we will turn, quote unquote, Russia into North Korea economically, isolate it from the global community. But of course, there are other viewpoints. And the professor rightly pointed out that we had, the majority of the globe's population, quote unquote, either abstain or voice a different opinion. This is clearly our Zeitenwende, or seems to be our Zeitenwende, our paradigm shift at the heart of Europe. But as we Europeans already taking on a somewhat more critical standpoint of China during the pandemic, where we had a number of economic and supply chain issues, where we had a number of health diplomacy issues, where something surprising happens that in a German coalition contract, suddenly China is described much more in the language of a transatlantic and American vernacular than prior. There are clear shifts in Europe. And so as Europe is rightly focused on the war at the heart of its continent, how does it look to China, looking at these options China might have to very much keep Russia on the international map?
First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to this extremely impressive symposium, and I'm super glad to be here, particularly to be here in person. Indeed, these are the big questions of today that we are discussing, and certainly there are a great variety of viewpoints and opinions on an issue where I think the main question is simple, actually. And it's no matter where you live, no matter where you place geographically. I think the main question is that how do we regard a war of aggression? How do we treat a country as a partner who launched a horrific attack on a sovereign country whose troops are responsible for mass murder, torture, and rape? And of course, from a European perspective, these questions are even more prominent because this war is happening in Europe. So it might not be in the European Union yet, but it's in Europe, a couple of hundreds of kilometers away from where I live, for instance. Hungary, a country that borders Ukraine, has citizens who can hear the air raid sirens going out at night. Mm-hmm. It's very close to us. So I believe, first of all, the European interest is to keep Ukraine safe, make the war stop, but stopping the war also means dealing with the aggressor. So our perspective is defined by the responses, what other countries are giving to this. And I don't believe this can be simplified to a very pragmatic approach. This is also ideologies in heart, the questions of democracy, values,
is it a fair split? Is that American narrative, quote unquote, democracy, autocracy? Is that a fair way to think about it from a Hungarian perspective, and then looking all the way toward China? Is that a fair split?
Well, I would believe that this is the baseline of how we consider our world, right? How do we think about freedoms, human rights, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of society? So this is a fair split, but of course, within this split, there are also further splits down the road. So I believe we as Europeans also have to think that what our own specific interests for the future are. And in your previous question, there were some hints about the lack of foresight, and maybe this is a situation that we have to deal with right now, and what we have to consider as Europeans, that where our places in the new world order. I am very glad to see that what we have been advocating for quite some time in the European Parliament, for Europe to be more autonomous strategically, faster in their decisions, and a stronger actor in the global scale, might be a process that is starting off sooner rather than later in the light of the challenges that are happening. And coming back to your previous question, I believe the future considerations with China will also be greatly dependent on how China, what is the Chinese response to, for instance, the sanctions we are posing on Russia? Right. If these very legitimate, I think, European interests can be also supported by the Chinese partners or not. This is a very fundamental strategic question. China is, of course, a very important partner for Europe, and we have to cooperate on a number of issues. Climate change, for instance, trade. A rules-based world order is, of course, something that we are hoping to achieve together with China. But the current war really has to put our security perspectives and our strategic autonomy to the heart of every decision we make.
Before I go to Marcus to give us sort of a 30,000-foot perspective from the way that he thinks about values and systems design as we move forward, I mean, you're seeing how China is reacting to, or you're getting tastes of, and so this gets back to, I don't know, if our strategic compass is now on the table, if our various instruments, and to be fair, European instruments have been, ramped up very quickly in response to this war. Do we have the right set of analytical tools to look at what might be happening at the the Russian-China border? We're just, about a year and a half ago, we had major military exercises. Do we have enough ability on the European side to game out, to see, just what I asked Professor Feng, what could happen? How could China react? And then what is our reaction? Are we, as the Union, strategic enough to play that out? To think beyond what isolation of Russia might mean?
I believe we are clearly lacking a lot of tools, and also have certain shortcomings when it comes to our internal cohesion or to our decision-making process. So I believe this is a work in progress, clearly. But as you mentioned, that the war really made us realize a lot of big truths, that if we are slow, then we are lost. If we are divided, if we are fragmented, then we are lost. If we cannot use our economic power better and put it in the heart of our geopolitical prowess, then also we are facing serious problems for our future path as Europe. So I'm not sure whether we have the capacities right now, but it's also true that if we cannot develop a possibility to respond very, very shortly, then we won't be able to live up to the challenges that we are facing. So we have to move forward.
Time is working against us, certainly. Yes. Marcus, we've been brave enough over the course of these 2 days here at the symposium to actually say what's frankly on the table, which is, what is world order going to look like beyond this war in Ukraine? If there is a beyond, maybe this becomes a war of attrition, a black hole, sinkhole at the heart of Europe, affecting every other piece. We talked about the famine, we talked about economic issues. Here we talked about food security going forward. Clearly, we've talked about energy and how that links to our interdependencies, how it might make us more dependent on other autocracies. Again, the Chinese example. What's your reaction to what you've heard this morning? And then give us your 30,000-foot assessment of where we are right now and how we should think this forward.
Well, I think obviously we are in a situation where we have the highest amount of social complexity that the planet has ever seen. For one thing, we're still in COVID, right? Sometimes we discuss, post-COVID world order, et cetera, but ask our colleague in China, which feels much more like a full-blown pandemic situation right now. So we are still in the pandemic. We are nowhere near having ended it. We are just in a better situation right now here in Switzerland and in Europe. Then the pandemic, of course, hangs together with what's happening in Russia. So I think that there's a significant causal contribution of the, in my opinion, way too strict border closures, right? The border regimes that we have imposed within Europe and also with our Russian neighbor significantly contribute to what's happening. And this is also a recommendation to our Chinese friend: open your borders. I think it's a strategic mistake that some of our Asian friends are making by closing those borders. I predicted in March 2020 that the border closure would lead to wars. I just didn't know where they would interrupt. But this is well known from border studies in political science, sociology, and social philosophy, because things hang together. So closing border triggers automatically some form of conflict. Now, all of this, of course, hangs together with the economy, right? Hangs together with, like new elections, the new rise of social democracy, Germany, Italy, Spain, and in a certain sense, the United States of America, which then in turn is part of a new transatlantic, et cetera, et cetera. I might go on and on and on. So that's the highest level of social complexity. And now here's an interesting paradox, what I call the grand synchronization. For the first time in human history, and let me emphasize this, for the first time in human history, in February and March 2020, all humans did the same thing on planet Earth, namely fight the pandemic, okay? Led by a Chinese model. Now, China has profited from this enormously in 2020 and 2021, right? Both ideologically and economically for a while, but now zero COVID is failing. So China is facing a situation where zero COVID is failing. So the ideology that we heard, look, after all, liberal democracy might not be able to handle global issues. Currently, right, the tides are shifting. So all of this still hangs together. And now Russia is in that picture, of course, with all sorts of geopolitical and economic and ideological interests. So I think that's what we need to look at. And also at the vocabulary that we're deploying. Russia might be our neighbor in some geographical sense of the term, but right now, like it or not, right, Russia is our enemy.
Absolutely.
So we are in a war, and the famous political thinker Carl Schmitt, who taught also at the University of Bonn in 1922 at Bonn, wrote this book, Political Theology, where he defines politics, right, as a negotiation of the friend-foe distinction. And that's what we have right now, literal geopolitics. And we are not used to this. So the blind spot in Europe, of course, has been that we thought geopolitics was over. China never thought that geopolitics was over, right? Nor did Russia. So that's an advantage. But I think that liberal democracies, right, can easily gain a new level of advantage, right, in the geopolitical condition due to moral superiority. And this is a doctrine, it's not just a European doctrine. In the theory of international relations, a big doctrine plays a huge role in China, so-called moral realism. Moral realism is the idea that in international relations, you dissolve, and I thereby conclude, social complexity by identifying what's morally good, claiming the moral high ground, and then resolving those paradoxes. This is my 30,000 feet view, right? Then by resolving social complexity in light of the following question. What's the morally right thing to do? Okay, I'm from Deguo, right? In China, Germany is called the country of virtue. So China can contribute something to those debates, and Germany can contribute moral philosophy.
The question is, though, okay, so you've made a very strong argument for interdependence, and Steve Walt and other realists and John Mearsheimer are turning over if they hear this, but you've made it in an interesting way because you've not made the crux that interdependence is universally good. You've said it's just fact.
Just
and
fact.
that, you know, and I mentioned this old adage that we, you know, the little glib summary of interdependence was always, you know, countries in which you find McDonald's don't fight one another. But, you know, the transformation of that would be, as Benjamin Franklin used to say, if we don't all hang together, we certainly will all hang separately. But how is that moral superiority working out for the West, which is now a widened West? You know, we've seen Japan very clearly step up. I mean, again, not part of its military tradition, not part of its political culture. Very, you know, in this past week in its discussion with the United States, the Australians, you know, offer LNG to the Europeans, for which we have no ports, but that's a different issue. You know, clearly the West is no longer the West, but you've obviously argued in your papers, of course, we're talking about universal values. But again, as the professor rightly pointed out, we saw this vote at the heart of the UN. Half the world did not immediately say, right, these are ours, here we go. So how is that convincing argument of moral superiority working in practice?
Yeah, so the weak spot of the European Union is that on various issues we actually have moral high ground, such as Ukraine, whereas in other respects we are the bad guy in town. So our Africa policy, some of the Eurocentrism that was also pointed out by Professor Fang, right? Some of those ideas have to be corrected, right? You have to tidy up your home first.
Well, isn't that precisely the problem that the Russians can now, you know, in American parlance, we say, whataboutism. All that we're getting out of Lavrov, all that we're getting out of Russian leadership is whataboutism, because what we have done in the years and decades of economic prosperity in the widened West, the 80s and 90s, we've trampled our institutional system. We have. I mean, so, you know, can we hold it against China that once they entered the WTO, they decided to massage the rules of the World Trade Organization in a way that it helped a self-interested China?
Well, the fact that we sometimes forget that an important element in the whole fake news bullshit, Putinism and so forth that we're facing, right, started in Italy with Berlusconi, then moved via George Bush, Iraq, and all of that, right? So, of course, but that does not entail any degree of justification for the moral atrocities in Ukraine. So imagine someone pointed out that some moral atrocity has been committed by, you know, like say, imagine I commit murder tonight in St. Gallen, and then, you know, I go to prison, and they say, well, but this other person in prison committed murder. Well, it doesn't hang together. So the fact, whatever Russia is doing, there's no relationship at all, 0 degree of justification. If you point out that George Bush already did, you know, something similar, that's equally morally pernicious. So the war in Iraq is like on this, you know, if you scale this, of course, nowhere nearly as bad as the war on Ukraine, because the Americans did not, you know, only few, but still crimes against humanity. But if you just compare, you know, like Bucha to Baghdad, you know, then the Americans, you know, bad enough. I'm not justifying this, but none of this justifies any of the moral atrocities. So this is just a horrible argument.
In the debates that you're having, Professor Zhang, in China, this idea that, of course, I mean, and Professor Gabbro mentioned this idea of moral realism, of a great desire for the Chinese to save face internationally, of recognition that the wolf warrior diplomacy around the pandemic and beyond may not have served Chinese interests. You mentioned it in your early statement for stability, particularly economic stability. And we had Karl Gernreiter this morning, or yesterday morning, tell us that we have 3,200 kilometers of industrial goods, if you put them side by side, lined up in the Shanghai harbor right now, speaking of Shanghai. How does that, can that serve China's diplomacy as it thinks about its relationship with Russia, but particularly its relationship with Europe? Could that be a counter argument at the heart of party discussions, at part of leadership discussions, to say, actually, we need to look at this differently because at the heart of hearts, our political philosophy must be different and stand against this war of aggression?
Okay, I think, I have listened our European colleagues talking about, all the theories, liberalism, Western liberalism. What's the most keywords in China, which guides all the Chinese internal policies, external policy is 4 characters. It's called seek the truth from the facts. This is a very important thing for our European colleagues to understand what China is talking about, what China's mindset in terms of the war against in Ukraine, in terms of the fighting zero policy in fighting the pandemic. China is happy to know what Europeans is dealing with pandemic. China is ready to know what Europeans is dealing with the Ukraine crisis, but we want to think about what is the best solution from a Chinese point of view, from Chinese interest point of view, from Chinese moral point of view. That will come out ultimately a Chinese approach, which is distinguished from others, but it's the approach which we think it's one suits China's interests, suits China's responsibilities, all very good way. So a lot of people, easily I can understand to know clear picture. Tell me yes or no about the Russian war, yes or no about the pandemic. Things are different, are much more complicated in China. At least what we think, it's much more complex than either answer. So China is doing a lot of things. It's like a laboratory experiment. Like what Europeans. I think Europeans did something in the post-Second World War, which is unprecedented. You started some revolutions in terms of international relations, in terms of Franco-German relations, and then in that time you don't have some theories, practically speaking, Western theories or written textbooks for telling French how to deal with Germany or Switzerland to deal with your neighborhood. And China is having similar experience like what you were doing in the early stage of the post-Second World War. We are thinking about what we can do as a number 2 in terms of GDP, economic force. What is our position in this world? What we should do? We make some tests. We make some experience. And we may learn the lessons, and gradually, step by step, that is the Chinese approach. And then
you are
think
making,
about Chinese
you are
policy
making
towards
steps
Russia.
as...
Think about Chinese policy towards this very controversial zero policy in fighting the pandemic. China is not Switzerland. China is not Europe.
No, very certainly
we have
not.
so much. It's such a great population. We have to be very careful.
That's it.
You can do things today, and tomorrow you say, I'm wrong. We will do it again.
You are making
China
these steps and decisions as a world power and as a nuclear world power. So we are very aware that China is not Switzerland. I'm
sorry to say that.
No, I'm a bit disheartened by the fact that Eric Lee can't be with us this morning because we would have, I think, profited immensely also from a business leader perspective from the Chinese side. But There are many people in this room who think very much about the future of interdependence as it manifests around choices, around business, around risk, around dependency. So I want to go over now to Q&A with all of you, and I know and understand that those are the issues that we're going to put on the table now, and we'll attempt to answer them best we can. There's a question right here in the fourth row in the middle, if we can get a microphone over there. Sounds like it's on.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm one of leaders tomorrow here, and I'm unbiased Japanese citizen. Yes, my question is for Professor Fon. I want to know, the war in Ukraine influenced foreign policy in China, specifically what to do with Taiwan.
Well, we knew this question was going to come up, and we will entertain it, both with this panel here, and I have a feeling the good professor is prepared for it as well. So, Professor Fong, go ahead.
Okay, let me tell you the honest answer, give you an honest answer. You know, the things worries Chinese most, at least worries me most, is I'm afraid we are going to the world is going back to a new Cold War. To be honest, you know, China was established, the new China was established 70 years ago, more than 70 years ago. We had experienced 40 years Cold War, 30 years post-Cold War. Okay, I am really worried about 2022, this year. We are going back to old time, which we will never miss, you know, we will never would like to go back. So Chinese foreign policy being affected, the question is, by the Ukraine crisis, is we will do our best, do everything we can, with Europeans, with others together, because I believe Europeans do not want to go back to the 40 years Cold War. Europe was the battlefield for that, you know, two blocks, east-west blocks. Cold War is terrible. It's confrontation block. And so China wants to work together with Europeans because I believe, you know, Europeans share Chinese interest in this. If this is a common ground, we need to refuse the world. We need to do everything to prevent this from coming back. If that is the influence, that is the one, I think, the most single influence we are now having.
Catalin, do 154 incursion flights into Taiwanese airspace read to you as a mitigation strategy in relations with Taiwan? How do you think about that as part of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the European Parliament?
Well, I'm not sure that this is the conclusion that we are drawing, indeed. Of course, we are watching with great interest, and I can only say that Europe, as our fellow speaker also pointed out, and as also I did, will hopefully forge a strategy in the future where the decision makings we do will be indeed based on our interests, and our interests are defined also based on this, the security of others in the world. We are watching with great interest. And also, I know that there are certain European member states who are a bit more proactive on this issue, and I can only hope that this won't result in a prolonged confrontation between China and certain European Union countries, such as Lithuania, for instance, where, let's say, mutual relations has not been ideal so far. So my hope is that the Europe of the future will be a Europe that holds together also in these kind of situations, and we will be able to speak with one voice and stand up for every single one of our member states, also supporting the choices they made in their foreign policies vis-à-vis Taiwan.
Well, we know that the Chinese leadership, at least, would not like that so much. Look at the Lithuania case, look at various ways in which China is trying to very overtly, ultimately, influence public opinion, also in the countries that we want to bring closer to Europe and stabilize, including the Western Balkans, Serbia, and other places. Marcus, your view on both the moral components around Taiwan's issues, security, sovereignty, and what European decisions might be, or European decisions could be, in engaging Taiwan, and whether that will lead to, an exacerbation, of course, with relations with China. We seemingly, in these last few instances, we have always been able to somehow bring it back, but maybe given now this war of aggression, things are changing.
I think one thing that's important to point out and add to some of the scenarios that were described is that the Second World War started in China with Japan's aggression against China. And there's a history of how Taiwan came into existence because the Nationalist Party was expelled by Mao's complicated geopolitical and so forth, first local strategy. And this then led also to the fact that the Cold War did not just happen in Europe, but we still have a Cold War, full-blown Cold War-style scenario in North and South Korea. So these are universal structures that are not at all limited to the European continent. China is a full member of the same strategic situation, which is why we all see these similarities, okay? It has, Ukraine is not Taiwan, it's different histories, right? But we need to look at all of this. We need, so the Second World War is not just a European problem, right? Also, China suffered the highest amount of deaths in the Second World War, even more than the Soviet Union. So those things are too easily forgotten. It was a literal world war, right? And not just a European graveyard.
Yeah.
And so I think we're completely still in those. So the mistake that we made, and partly due to the role that America has been playing in the post-war world construction, is that we forgot history. America is not great at understanding history.
No, the Americans are all about the
or
future.
having one. So part of the problem here is also America for that reason. Now, and this is something that Europe shares much more with China, which of course has much more history than Europe. Okay, so from a Chinese perspective, we are the new kids on the block. And so I think those kinds of things are something that we need to take into account, and also to really begin on a very fundamental level to understand each other in those historical social terms again. So we're discussing collaborative advantage here. Like one way of translating collaborative advantage into Chinese would be 共产主义, communism. So communism, the Chinese word for communism, is the doctrine that you gotta produce together. 共产. 共产. So that means, right, so collaborative advantage. And I think, in order to achieve like a new level of discussion, also with China right now, and with Hungary, which is caught between, like various tendencies, Russia, China, and, the other elephant in the room, Katalin, does precisely not represent him, Orban. All of those things are deep historical discussions. And so that's crucial. We discuss all of this in a wrong presentism, as if we have to solve something right now.
Marcus, you're right to point this out, and Prime Minister Trudeau reminded us in literally his last 3 sentences of his video speech yesterday that we need to keep very much in mind the roots of conflict that beget, that begin in history and beget the situation in which we find ourselves now. And we've been discussing since very, early yesterday morning about, is collaboration always an endemic value? What makes collaboration happen? Exogenous pressure, endogenous pressure, and then is it always universally good, as the title of this conference seems to propose and underline? And we're not entirely sure whether we've actually answered that question quite yet. We'll talk again tonight at 5 p.m. More questions, go ahead. Oh, microphone is coming up behind you.
Thank you. My name is Peter. I'm also leader of Tomorrow. And I'd like to ask one question, but in two different forms to the panelists. So the first one goes to Katalin. Do you know, or can you tell, to what extent did the nuclear threat of Russia play a role in the response of the EU? To what extent that has been a motivational factor behind EU policies that have been decided in the wake of the aggression? And I also have a question to Mr. Zhang Ping. Do you fear, from a Chinese perspective, that because of this nuclear threat again, which I think is an equally important thing as the war itself, do you think that a taboo has been broken and that maybe it might be used also by other nuclear powers around the world to kind of push through their interests or their aggression? Thank you.
Catalina, we'll have you start, and then we'll end up in Beijing.
Well, nuclear threat, as combined with all the other processes and all the other approaches we've seen in Russia ever since the war started, I think greatly inspired the European reaction, which has been, I believe, much more forceful, much more united, and much more strategic than I think everybody else would thought. I wouldn't single out like one specific threat out of the entire package that we are witnessing at our border, but it's very clear for Europe, I believe, that this long fairy tale type of strategy that we've been following maybe a bit too naively over the past years has to end. We are living amidst very fastly changing geopolitical realities, and we need to integrate much closer together. And I really hope that this will guide also our future policies. Because, I mean, let's say the way how the EU usually responds, the time what our decisions take, and also our internal divisions, the lack of unanimity on even the most fundamental issues really puts the future of the EU into peril. Mm-hmm. So I really hope that we are also learning from this situation, that if we want to be relevant globally, we have to be able to act with the same velocity, the same strength, and the same unity on other big, large issues. And I can only hope that my country, Hungary, will, we just had elections, but I hope that on the at least medium term, we can be also a constructive driver and not a blocker of this process.
I like the fact that you mentioned velocity. I think speed and time is always of the essence here. Professor Zhang.
Okay, let me tell you, this war has lasted already for 2 months, and we don't know when it's going to end. The point is, this war could have taken place in 2008. You see, why 2008? Because that time, George Bush was the president of the United States at that time. He actually pushed the membership of Ukraine and Georgia in 2008 to be, he was to these 2 countries to join NATO. And at that time, we already know in China, people like me say, okay, a war is imminent, what's going to happen? Because we know this is a red line. And we are not talking about, this is right or not. We are not talking about Ukraine. Georgia has the right to be to join a military club or not. We're just talking about the facts. Okay. And this war was successfully being avoided not by Putin, but by German Chancellor Merkel and the French President Chirac. They jointly made made a joint efforts in convincing American administration at that time, say this is stupid. If we do this, we are going to facing a war, direct war, full-scale war with Russia. What I'm telling you is this: we need to have a lot of realism in our foreign policies, in understanding international situation. European countries I respect. You are living in a so-called post-modern world. But I think a lot of politicians understand, this is over. This is over. It's not just because of the war. It's already thinking about the great powers rivalries some years ago. So realism does not mean you have to sacrifice some important values. No. But realism means we need to understand other people's mindset. And then figure out how to deal with them. If Europeans can be realistic enough, this time not in 2008, 3 months ago,
I'll say,
let Putin to understand, okay, Ukraine is not ready to join the NATO anytime soon. We are not going to say this war. And European countries are not going to make such a sacrifice in terms of food, in terms of oil, in terms of everything for fighting this so-called liberal war. I'm afraid, we need to think about when Putin's saying, when his foreign minister saying nuclear weapons is not off the table, we need to take this seriously. A few days ago, I was invited to be a television program. The moderator asked me, what do you think about this? Is this going to be a threat? I said, okay. We made mistakes. I mean, Europeans, Americans made mistakes at the end of last year. When Putin said, please, he didn't say please. He said, no membership of Ukraine. That's it. No more, no less. And he didn't receive a proper answer, I think. And you could have a lot of reasons to say why we should refuse Putin. But we have to face the fact.
Yeah.
Today, the similar situation come back again. Nuclear threat. Okay, I think we're better to understand this. I understand, I'm not an expert on Russia, but I understand that there is no failure in Putin's dictionary.
Yeah, I think your point is well taken. I think we have discussed over these last 2 days that it's interesting to use the word understand. At the very least, we have to analytically read, analyze, see, put in the context of history, effectively do the job that everybody in this room who studies political science or studied political science, because it is a science at the end of the day, was and has been trained to do. So when we say the word understand, we don't necessarily mean it in the way that is being bandied about around the Russland verstehe, but we do need to pay greater and more careful attention to what other parts of the world are saying. I thought you said that it was a very astute remark. The world has changed forever, particularly for the Europeans. And I think Katalin noted very clearly that we have to understand that in order to be, as a middle power, a power that continues to play and assert its values, understand how it will echo in a world that's rapidly shifting underfoot, it will have to do things faster, it will have to do things more clearly, it will have to do things with a view of partnerships that move beyond its geographical location. Please join me in thanking our 3 panelists.